It started with the kind of renovation no one ever expects to become a doorway into a much older, darker world. The house on Briarwell Lane had stood for more than a century, its bones creaking with secrets, its walls stained with the weight of time. When the new owner, Daniel Mercer, first stepped inside, he imagined fresh paint, new flooring, maybe a modern kitchen, nothing more sinister than the usual mix of dust and dead wiring left behind by generations. But on the third afternoon, while exploring the attic that smelled of mildew and forgotten winters, he found something that didn't belong to the present at all. The attic itself was cramped, lit only by slashes of sunlight cutting through warped wooden slats. Fiberglass insulation lay torn in places, as if small animals had nested there long ago and moved on. Daniel had almost given up inspecting the space when he noticed a darker rectangle in the far corner, half hidden under a moth-eaten quilt. His flashlight beam caught the edge of a rusted metal clasp, and curiosity, stubborn, innocent curiosity, pushed him closer. There, beneath decades of dust, sat a trunk. Heavy, wooden, reinforced with iron bands that had blackened with age. It was the kind of thing one might expect in a museum, not in a forgotten attic of a suburban home. The lid bore scratches, deep, uneven grooves, as if someone had tried desperately to open it or perhaps tried even harder to keep it closed. Daniel hesitated. Strange objects in old houses usually turned out to be worthless junk left by former owners, yet something about this trunk felt deliberate. As if it had been placed, not forgotten. He knelt, wiped dust from the metal clasp, and felt a pulse of unease. The lock wasn't broken but had simply rusted through, fragile enough to crumble with a twist. When he lifted the lid, a gust of cold, stale air pushed upward, carrying with it the scent of old paper, leather, and something faintly metallic. For a moment, Daniel imagined he heard a sigh escape from the trunk, though he later convinced himself it was only the wood settling. Inside lay a neat stack of envelopes, bound with a deteriorated ribbon. Their corners were browned, edges brittled by time, but the handwriting, thin, elegant strokes of black ink, remained strangely bold. Beneath the letters sat a smaller bundle wrapped in linen cloth and a leather-bound notebook stiff with age. Before touching anything, Daniel paused, trying to understand why a shiver crawled up his arms. He'd expected trinkets, maybe photographs or outdated documents, but these letters, they looked personal. Intentional. He lifted the top envelope. The date on the front read, February 3, 1891. Below it, the name Elias Corvin. Daniel didn't recognize the name, but there was something unsettling about seeing handwriting from more than a century ago, something almost intimate, invasive even, as though he were trespassing into a life that never expected to be discovered. The first letter began innocuously enough, winter hardships, expenses, a mention of poor health. But as he read further, the tone shifted, subtly at first, then sharply. Elias wrote of a figure in the fog, of men watching him from corners that seemed empty moments before, of symbols etched into his doorstep at night. His words trembled with paranoia, yet something about the descriptions felt too specific to dismiss as delusion. Daniel turned to the next page. This one carried a small sketch, a symbol composed of interlocking circles with a vertical line running through their center. Hand-drawn yet precise. Underneath, Elias had written, "It appears again. Always the same mark. Always before another is taken." Daniel frowned. Another what? Taken by whom? He flipped through more letters, his pulse quickening as the tone darkened with each passing week. Elias chronicled mentions of whispers beneath floorboards. Of a ritual that, reborn itself in blood. Of a shadowed group he claimed had origins in a medieval sect committed to preserving some ancient covenant. It would have been easy to dismiss these letters as the writings of a man unraveling, if not for one line written in a shaky hand at the end of a later letter, "They will silence me soon. But the ritual must be stopped. Look for the symbol when the cycle begins anew." Daniel lowered the paper slowly, unsettled even before the next discovery. At the bottom of the trunk lay a single envelope, sealed with wax that had cracked but not broken. Its color, once deep red, had turned to a dark, muddy brown. On the front, in faded ink, was written, "For the one who finds this when the signs return." He didn't open it, not yet. Something about breaking that seal felt final, irreversible, as if opening the envelope would pull him into a narrative that had been paused for over a century, waiting patiently for its next participant. Instead, he set it aside and reached for the notebook. The leather cover flaked beneath his fingers, and the pages crackled when he opened them. The entries inside were erratic, some lengthy, others consisting only of frantic sketches of the symbol. One page stood out because it wasn't written in 19th-century ink but appeared discolored by soot or char. In large, uneven strokes, Elias had written, "The ritual will find its descendant. Blood remembers." Daniel exhaled, trying to rationalize the dread creeping into his spine. Old stories, old fears. People in the 1800s believed in all kinds of superstitions. But as he closed the notebook, intending to pack everything and perhaps research the previous homeowners, his phone buzzed, a notification from a news app he barely used. At the top of the feed was a headline that froze him in place: "Police investigate ritualistic markings at local crime scene." Beneath the title was an image, a blurred photo taken from behind yellow tape. But even blurred, even pixelated, Daniel recognized the symbol carved on the victim's skin. The same symbol from Elias Corvin's letters. In that moment, the attic seemed colder. The shadows longer. The trunk heavier with meaning. And Daniel sensed, without fully understanding, that whatever Elias had tried to warn about hadn't died with him in 1891. It had awakened again. And somehow, unbelievably, it had been waiting for someone to find those letters. The police reports would later describe the crime scene as methodically brutal, a phrase that felt contradictory yet disturbingly accurate. The murder had occurred 3 nights before Daniel discovered the trunk, long enough for the media to run their theories, yet recent enough that the scent of fear still lingered in the neighborhood where it happened. The victim, a 32-year-old woman named Marissa Hale, had been found in an abandoned utility shed near the river, her body positioned deliberately, as if arranged. It was this precision that unsettled investigators from the start. Detective Aaron Whitmore arrived shortly after sunrise. He wasn't new to homicide scenes, his 12 years on the force had steeled him against the grotesque, but something about this scene felt colder, wrong in a way that trained instincts couldn't fully articulate. The shed's interior was mostly empty, a few rotted boards, dirt, broken jars. But the focus was the body, illuminated by the pale beam of a forensics lamp. Marissa's arms were placed at her sides. Her eyes were closed, almost peacefully, which contrasted violently with the single carved mark on her sternum. The cut wasn't jagged or frantic, it was clean, almost surgical. A symbol carved directly into her skin. Detective Whitmore crouched beside the mark, brow furrowing as he traced the shape with his eyes, intersecting circles with a vertical line running through the center. It wasn't gang-related. It wasn't random. It wasn't anything he had seen in modern criminal patterns. "Looks ritualistic," a crime tech muttered behind him. "We don't say that word," Whitmore replied automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. Ritualistic implied purpose. Intent. Belief. And those were far more dangerous than impulse crimes. The medical examiner's early notes only deepened the mystery. No defensive wounds. No signs of sexual assault. No traditional cause of death. The ME suspected a form of asphyxiation, but even that was uncertain. More perplexing was the missing item noted in the report, a small iron pendant Marissa always wore, according to her sister. The chain was found snapped at the scene, but the pendant itself was gone. A trophy? Or something the killer believed they needed? That question wouldn't settle easily. Later that afternoon, the investigative team gathered in a cramped conference room at the precinct. Photos from the crime scene were clipped to a large corkboard, angles of the body, close-ups of the carved symbol, the snapped chain, the shed's interior. Detective Whitmore stood at the front, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He didn't like cases that felt too staged. They always meant the killer had a message, and killers with messages usually had plans for more than one victim. A new voice broke his concentration, the voice of Officer Lena Hart, a recent transfer from the Historical Crimes Division. Soft-spoken but sharp-eyed, Lena leaned forward in her chair, studying the symbol more closely than the others. "I've seen this before," she said quietly. Whitmore turned. "In another case?" "In several," she answered. "But not recent ones. Old ones. Really old." The room shifted, several officers exchanging skeptical looks. Lena didn't flinch. She stepped toward the board and tapped the symbol lightly. "This pattern, or variations of it, appears in medieval records documenting a series of unexplained deaths tied to a religious cult. The markings were believed to be identifiers, signs that the victim was part of something larger." Whitmore exhaled. "We're not opening folklore as evidence. We work with facts." Lena nodded. "I understand. But this symbol isn't coincidental. It's too exact." She pointed to the curved lines. "This isn't random carving, it's mathematically balanced. Whoever made it knew the original design." Another detective scoffed. "So we're hunting what? A time traveler?" "No," Lena replied steadily. "Someone who studied this. Someone who believes in it." She didn't add the last part aloud, but it hung in her expression, someone who might be part of something still alive. Whitmore dismissed the room, but the seed of doubt had already settled in him. He lingered behind after the others dispersed, studying the symbol again. Ritualistic crimes weren't unheard of, but they usually left room for interpretation. This one didn't. This was too structured, too intentional. He flipped through Marissa Hale's background file. No criminal history. No unusual associations. A preschool teacher. Quiet, introverted, lived alone. Nothing suggested involvement in anything resembling a cult or secret society. So why her? The case should have ended there, a disturbing but isolated homicide with an eccentric killer. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. A small local publication released a photo taken from beyond the police perimeter on the night of the murder, a blurry shot of the shed door. Most people saw nothing unusual. But a junior investigator, scrolling through the images again, spotted something others had missed. Barely visible under the porch light, scratched into the shed's wooden doorframe, was a faint version of the same symbol found on Marissa's chest. Weathered. Faded. And clearly not made recently. When the shed's ownership records were pulled, investigators learned the structure had been standing for nearly 100 years, and the scratches on the wood were old. Older than the victim. Older than the entire investigative team. Old enough that they could not be connected to the killer. Unless this had all happened before. Unless the symbol wasn't just a calling card, but a cycle. Detective Whitmore found himself staring at the symbol long after he should have gone home. The more he looked at it, the more familiar it felt, not from any modern case files, but from something deeper, almost archetypal. Symbolic in the truest sense. But it wasn't until Lena placed a medieval sketch beside the modern photograph that the room fell silent. The two symbols were identical. Perfectly identical. Whitmore's skepticism cracked. Whoever killed Marissa had intimate knowledge of a medieval ritual long believed to be myth, and possibly access to documents historians no longer had. That realization left the entire investigative unit with one chilling possibility: this wasn't just a crime. It was a resurrection. And the killer wasn't finished. The name Elias Corvin meant nothing to Daniel at first. It was just ink on old paper, another forgotten man swallowed by the 19th century. But as he sat at his kitchen table late into the night, carefully laying each letter across the surface, Elias began to take shape. Not as a relic of the past, but as a living presence. A voice that trembled through every page, trying desperately to reach across time. The earliest letters were calm, almost mundane. Elias wrote with the structured politeness typical of educated men of his era. He mentioned weather patterns, shipments delayed by winter storms, financial troubles that seemed to gnaw at the edges of his livelihood. His handwriting was steady then, elegant, confident. A man who believed he understood the world he lived in. But the shift was unmistakable. By the fourth letter, the sentences elongated with panic. Words repeated. Ink strokes deepened, as if pressed harder into the page by a trembling hand. Elias wrote of footsteps behind him at night, of shadows that moved without bodies, of the feeling, no, certainty, that someone watched him through his windows even when the curtains were drawn. I hear them whispering beneath the floorboards, he wrote in one letter. Their voices rise with the moon. For a moment, Daniel wondered if Elias had been mentally ill, trapped in paranoia during a time when diagnoses were crude and often cruel. But then came the drawings, dozens of them, evidence too consistent, too patterned to dismiss as delusion. Every sketch showed the same symbol, interlocking circles divided by a central vertical line. Sometimes it appeared alone. Other times it was carved into trees, drawn in ash on Elias's door, stamped into wax seals on letters he claimed to receive from unknown senders. One entry chilled Daniel more than the rest, they leave me these signs when another is taken. I have counted 6 this year alone, though the papers report only 2. They are clever with their disguises, but they cannot hide their design. The symbol binds their work. The letters revealed glimpses of the world Elias lived in, small town, narrow streets, families who kept secrets locked tighter than their doors. He mentioned names, the Aldwins, the Mercer family, the Blackthorns. He wrote of gatherings he was not invited to, of stairs that lingered too long, of a council of men who met in the dead of night at the old stone chapel outside town. Daniel recognized one name immediately, Mercer. His own last name. It made him pause, breath stuttering slightly, but he brushed it off as coincidence. Mercer was common. This didn't mean anything. Not yet. The middle letters were the most harrowing. Elias's life seemed to unravel piece by piece. His business failed. His friends stopped visiting. Neighbors walked past him without acknowledgement. And all the while, the symbols, those same intricate marks, kept appearing. This town is sick, Elias wrote. Rotten from its roots. There are men, descendants of a forgotten order, who believe they must preserve the old ways. They have chosen their successor. I fear they believe it is me. Daniel read that sentence 3 times, unable to shake the dread embedded in it. Why him? What made Elias believe he had been chosen? Was it paranoia, or something far more calculated? In a letter dated late autumn of 1891, Elias described his breaking point. He claimed he had intercepted a message, a parchment slipped under his door bearing the symbol drawn in fresh red ink. Beneath it, a phrase, the 10th veil must rise again. The letter ended abruptly, the last sentences trailing off as if Elias had been interrupted. He wrote of packing his belongings, of planning to flee, of seeking help from a distant relative. The fear in his writing felt tangible, as if the ink itself carried vibrations of his terror. But the next letter contradicted the plan entirely. It wasn't written to anyone. It wasn't structured like a message. It read more like a confession, or a warning. Daniel unfolded it carefully, feeling the fragile paper threaten to tear. I have seen the ritual site, Elias wrote. Beneath the chapel. Beneath the earth. Their lineage survives. They follow bloodlines, track them, guard them, cull them. I was a fool to believe I could leave. My family's connection binds me to this place more tightly than chains. He described a chamber lit by candles positioned in a perfect circle. Stone carvings washed with old Latin phrases. A pedestal stained with something Elias could not identify. And in the center, a cloak, velvet, black, adorned with the same symbol stitched in silver. It was impossible to tell whether Elias had seen this chamber in person or in some fevered vision, but the description was too detailed to dismiss easily. Daniel's unease deepened as he uncovered one of the final letters, written in a shaky, almost illegible script. "They have taken the last descendant. They will come for me tonight. If these letters survive, may they speak for me when I no longer can." There was no further correspondence. No record of Elias's death. No burial certificate. Nothing. It was as though he had vanished completely, swallowed by the very shadows he had spent months writing about. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples as the weight of Elias's despair settled heavily over him. Yet one thing stood out above all else, the absolute belief Elias had that these ritualists, whoever they were, would return. "They return when blood remembers," Elias wrote in his final line. "And the blood has begun to stir again." Daniel pushed back from the table. The lighting in the room suddenly felt too dim, the air too still. The letters were no longer just old paper, they were a window into a horror that might never have ended. He glanced again at the newest news headline on his phone, the symbol carved on the victim's chest. And then at EIA's warnings. If Elias's final words were true. This wasn't the return. This was the continuation. A cycle unbroken. Something Elias had tried to stop more than a century ago, now unfolding once more, except this time, Daniel was the one who had opened the trunk. And the ritual had begun again. Long before Elias Corvin ever felt eyes watching him from the dark, long before Marissa Hale's body was found marked with a symbol no modern database could identify, the origins of the ritual lay buried in centuries-old soil, hidden among half-burned manuscripts, forgotten church records, and whispered legends that historians dismissed as superstition. But the deeper one digs into medieval Europe, the more one realizes that the past was not governed by logic alone. It was shaped by fear, blood, and the desperate belief that some forces could be appeased only through sacrifice. The earliest traces of the ritual known as the 10th Veil dated back to the mid-1300s, a time when plague, famine, and rebellion scarred every corner of the continent. In these years of devastation, secret societies flourished, groups convinced that divine punishment had been unleashed upon humanity and that only the chosen few could restore the balance. One such group, obscure and largely unrecorded, emerged in a remote region near what is now southern Germany. They called themselves Custodes Noctis, the keepers of the night. Few documents survived, but the ones that did revealed unsettling patterns. The keepers believed the world was divided into 10 veils, layers separating mankind from the divine truth. As each veil was lifted, they claimed, more of humanity's true nature would be revealed. Rumors said that 9 veils had fallen throughout ancient history, each through a cataclysmic event, floods, fires, mass deaths. The 10th veil, according to their doctrine, could be lifted only through deliberate act, a ritual of blood selection. They believed certain bloodlines carried fragments of an ancient purity. Not nobility. Not royalty. Something older, more arcane. Their goal was not domination, but preservation, at least in their eyes. When famine threatened a village, when plague struck a town, when crops failed and children died, the keepers interpreted these tragedies not as natural cycles but signs that the 10th veil remained closed. Their solution was horrifying: identify a descendant of the ancient line, mark them with the sacred symbol, and offer them as a vessel. Historians studying these manuscripts noted how often the symbol appeared, etched beside names, sketched in margins, carved into the stone of a chapel door that still stands today though weathered by time. The symbol was precise in every depiction, 2 circles representing the duality of man and spirit, intersected by a single line representing the divine path meant to guide the chosen. To the keepers, carving the mark into a victim's flesh was not murder. It was ceremony. One account, preserved in a monastery chronicle written by a monk named Albrecht, described the aftermath of such a ritual. Villagers discovered the body of a young woman positioned before an altar, hands folded, the symbol freshly carved on her chest. Albrecht wrote, "Her eyes were closed as though in peaceful sleep, yet the air around her was heavy, thick with the presence of something that did not belong to God." The monk pleaded for intervention, for the local clergy to banish the sect, but fear silenced most. Records suggested that the keeper's influence spread quietly, infecting small towns and isolated communities. Their ritual persisted for nearly a century before something changed. A rebellion. The details were scarce, but one surviving parchment described a night of fire, the chapel burned, members hunted down. The leaders were executed, their writings confiscated by regional authorities. Many believed the sect had been wiped out entirely. Yet even in their destruction, one chilling phrase appeared repeatedly in the ancient documents: "The blood remembers, and it will call us home when the lines converge again." This idea, bloodlines as carriers of destiny, persisted even after their eradication. Some medieval families kept genealogical records obsessively, not to preserve heritage but to ensure they were not tied to the ancient line. Others, more superstitious, believed the keepers would one day return for the descendants of those once marked. When Daniel dug deeper into the history, he found references to something the keepers called the awakening cycle. Every few centuries, when the descendants of the original chosen bloodline unknowingly crossed paths in the same region, the ritual was believed to reawaken. This convergence, they claimed, was a cosmic alignment that made sacrifice necessary again. It was impossible to verify how many people in the medieval era had been killed under the guise of this ritual. Many deaths likely went unrecorded, chalked up to plague or criminal violence. But one chilling detail in the text stood out: the ritual always involved a symbol carved with exact mathematical precision. The same symbol found on Marissa Hale's body. And yet, the medieval story had an end, or at least what historians interpreted as one. In 1472, the last known leader of the keepers, a man named Seraphin Holt, was captured and executed. His final recorded words before the blade fell were transcribed by an attending priest: "It is not death that ends our work. It is blood. It is time. And time will bring them back." The priest, horrified by the cryptic declaration, added his own note beneath the transcription: "May God grant that these words never find truth." For centuries, scholars debated whether the keepers were a myth. Some said they were no more dangerous than stories told to frighten children. Others, digging into genealogy archives, noted unsettling patterns: family lines that vanished abruptly, migrations that followed unexplained tragedies, and symbols carved into stones hidden deep in forest ruins. But nobody believed the ritual could survive into the modern era. Not seriously. Not until a victim appeared with a symbol identical to one drawn almost 700 years earlier. Detective Lena Hart, reviewing a medieval codex in her dimly lit office, realized something far more unsettling: the modern crime scene wasn't just inspired by the ritual. It replicated it exactly. Same markings. Same positioning. Same missing item, the pendant, which in medieval times represented the selected vessel's identity. Even more disturbing, the keepers believed the chosen descendant would unknowingly lead the ritual to its next phase. They were never meant to understand their role. They were simply meant to be found. Lena stared at the symbol, tracing the line through its center. A thought crept into her mind, a possibility she didn't dare voice yet. If the ritual required a specific bloodline? If the medieval sect kept detailed lineage records? If those records survived? Then someone alive today knew exactly who the next victims were meant to be. And worse, they might already be watching them. The medieval world may have buried the keepers of the night under fire and execution, but rituals do not need entire societies to survive. They need only one believer. And somewhere, hidden in the modern shadows, that believer had awakened. Detective Aaron Whitmore had always believed that every crime, no matter how bizarre or brutal, had a human explanation. Someone with motives, impulses, weaknesses. Someone you could question, corner, break. But by the second week of the investigation, he felt that belief slipping through his fingers like sand. Nothing about Marissa Hale's murder aligned with anything human, at least not anything he recognized. And once the medieval connection entered the conversation, his team began dividing into two uneasy camps: those who believed the ritual theory had merit, and those who rejected it outright as superstition contaminating police work. The tension began quietly, like a hairline crack in a wall. Officers whispered their doubts in hallways, exchanged glances during briefings. Some openly mocked Lena Hart's historical insights, calling them storybook nonsense. Others, those who had seen enough darkness to know not everything fits neatly in case files, privately admitted that the ritualistic precision of the crime bothered them. But no one said it aloud, not officially. No one wanted to be the detective who endorsed medieval cult activity in the 21st century. The autopsy results arrived late on a Tuesday evening. The medical examiner, Dr. Rourke, presented them in a tone so measured it bordered on clinical detachment, but even she failed to hide her confusion. Marissa's organs showed no signs of struggle. Her lungs showed faint signs of oxygen deprivation, but not enough to confirm suffocation. No drugs, no toxins. The symbol carved on her skin, however, appeared to have been made after she died, yet the tissue showed no bleeding consistent with post-mortem incision. The cut was peculiar. As if the blade had met no resistance. One detective whispered, "What the hell does that even mean?" but no one answered. Lena suggested they re-examine local missing person cases. Whitmore agreed reluctantly, not because he believed her theory about lineage-driven ritual killings, but because they desperately needed some kind of pattern. They combed through years of cases and stumbled upon something unsettling: 2 disappearances in the last decade involving individuals who had also worn distinctive pendants described by relatives as family heirlooms passed down for generations. Both individuals had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no suspects, no motives. And in both cases, the police reports included a tiny detail that had seemed irrelevant at the time: a strange carved marking found somewhere near the victim's last known locations. The symbol wasn't identical to the one on Marissa's chest, but its geometry was similar. Too similar to dismiss. When Whitmore pinned the photos beside Marissa's, the room fell silent. No one mocked Lena that day. But the more they uncovered, the more the team fractured. Every discovery seemed to push the investigation further away from conventional policing. Some detectives believed the killer was simply recreating ancient imagery, someone obsessed with medieval occult history, perhaps reenacting old practices. Others believed the killer had access to historical archives no ordinary civilian would ever find. Lena pushed deeper into archives, visiting university collections and church records. She found references to descendants of the medieval sect scattered through history, some families who changed their names, some who relocated to escape whispers of their ancestors' involvement. She discovered that in 1890s records, the very era of Elias Corvin, an unusual spike in disappearances had been reported across 3 towns, all within 20 miles of where Daniel Mercer now lived. Cycles, she told Whitmore quietly. They happened in cycles. Like someone waiting for the right alignment. "Stop," Whitmore snapped. But the anger wasn't at her. It was at the possibility that she might be right. Meanwhile, internal pressure grew. The precinct captain demanded results, hinting that Whitmore's team was wandering off course. The media had latched onto the phrase "ritualistic markings," fueling public hysteria. Ministers preached about spiritual warfare. Conspiracy groups flooded online forums with theories ranging from demonic involvement to government cover-ups. Every new headline made the investigation harder, tighter, more scrutinized. Then, just as tensions reached breaking point, a new piece of evidence arrived, one that fractured the unity of the team entirely. It came in a plain, unmarked envelope delivered to the precinct's front desk. No return address. No postage stamp. Someone had walked it in. Inside was a single sheet of aged paper, folded carefully, smelling faintly of soot. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, unmistakably old-fashioned. Lena froze when she saw it. Whitmore stared at her reaction, then at the page. When he read the handwritten lines, a chill tightened around his spine. To the watchers who blind themselves with reason, the cycle begins where the last blood was taken. Do not interfere. The selection has already been made. Below the lines was the symbol, the exact symbol found on Marissa's chest. But it wasn't the content that sent dread rippling through the team. It was the handwriting. Lena retrieved a letter from Elias Corvin's trunk that Daniel had shown her earlier that week. She placed them side by side. Letter for letter. Loop for loop. The handwriting was identical. Whitmore shook his head immediately. It's impossible. It's a forgery. Someone studied the letters and copied the style. Maybe, Lena said, though her voice faltered. But how would they know about Elias's letters? They weren't public. They've never been archived. Daniel only discovered them days ago. Whitmore didn't respond. He didn't want to admit the implications. But the room had already felt it, the creeping sense that someone out there had access not only to ancient ritual knowledge, but to Elias Corvin's private writings. Writings that had been locked away for over a century. Writings that should have been untouchable. The team split that day in earnest. Some detectives refused to believe the letter's authenticity, insisting it had to be a prank, a misdirection by the killer to create hysteria. Others argued that the historical parallels were too precise, too perfect to be coincidence. Lena felt torn between logic and intuition. Every step deeper into the past made the present feel stranger, narrower, as if the ritual had woven itself through time like a thread pulling everything together. When she traced victims' family trees, she found repeating surnames, branches converging unexpectedly, bloodlines intertwining in ways that felt orchestrated rather than random. Patterns. Everything pointed to patterns. That night, while the precinct quieted and most officers called it quits, Whitmore sat alone in the briefing room, staring at two photographs, the modern crime scene and a centuries-old medieval sketch Lena had shown him. The drawings were mirror images. Every curve, every angle of the symbol matched with inhuman precision. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away exhaustion, but the unease only grew heavier. He thought of Marissa Hale's peaceful expression, the absence of struggle, the missing pendant. He thought of the faded scratches on the shed doorframe, too old to be connected to the recent crime, yet too deliberate to be meaningless. Then he thought of the warning in the unmarked letter, the selection has already been made. What selection? Another victim? An heir? A descendant? Or something worse? Before he could follow that thought, a soft knock came at the door. Lena stepped inside, clutching a new folder. Her expression was grave. You need to see this, she said. Inside the folder was a genealogical chart she had constructed, connecting Marissa Hale, the missing persons from years prior, and several 19th-century families from Elias Corvin's town. At the center of the chart was a name circled in red. A name Whitmore recognized instinctively. A name that made his heart drop. Because it wasn't the victim's name. It wasn't a suspect's name. It was someone connected to the investigation. Someone they had trusted. And if the chart was correct, this person wasn't just connected to the medieval bloodline. They were the primary descendant. Whitmore stared at the circled name, feeling the air drain from the room. If the ritual truly followed bloodlines. If the keepers believed in a chosen vessel. Then the killer, or the group behind the killer, wasn't operating blindly. They were following a map. And one of his own was at the center of it. Worse still, Whitmore sensed the true horror, if the chosen descendant was among them. The killer might not need to find their target. Because the target was already here. Inside the investigation. Watching everything unfold. The chart Lena revealed lingered in Whitmore's mind long after he left the precinct that night. It wasn't just a chart, it was a map carved through centuries, a web of names stretching backward and forward in time until it landed squarely on one person in the present day. A person alive, breathing, moving among them. But the horror wasn't simply that the bloodline still existed. It was the realization that the bloodline hadn't been random at all. It had been followed. The genealogical work began innocently enough. Lena had contacted a pair of independent genealogists who occasionally assisted law enforcement with cases involving unidentified remains or long-lost family ties. Neither of them expected anything unusual when she brought them the files. They began tracing Marissa Hale's ancestry, cross-referencing old census reports, church baptism records, immigration documents. It was routine, until both genealogists stumbled upon an unusual pattern. Marissa's maternal line had gaps, long, conspicuous gaps, where records should have existed. Entire generations missing, burned church records, court documents lost during a town hall fire nearly a century ago. But some fragments survived, a birth certificate bearing a surname recorded in medieval lineage charts from the Custodes Noctis. A marriage license linking Marissa's great-grandmother to a man descended from one of the families Elias Corvin had written about. The same family name that appeared repeatedly in the medieval rituals. 6 centuries apart, yet connected by blood. Whitmore dismissed it at first. Coincidence. The sort of anomaly that appears when thousands of documents overlap. But the genealogists were thorough, calculating probability ranges. The chance that Marissa's lineage intersected with the ancient bloodline documented by medieval scribes was less than 2. And the chance that the 2 missing persons from the past decade also connected to the same line? Less than 0.1%. No detective in the room wanted to believe in fate or ancient design, but the numbers were merciless. Families weren't disappearing at random. Someone was eliminating, or selecting, specific descendants. Lena spread out the documents across the table, tracing each line with delicate precision. She pointed to the surnames Elias mentioned in his letters: Aldwin, Mercer, Blackthorne. Families that had relocated over centuries, their lines branching across continents, surviving wars, epidemics, migrations. These families were watched, she said softly. Not just in Elias's time. Perhaps even before. The more she explained, the heavier the room felt. The idea that an ancient sect could track bloodlines for centuries defied rational explanation, and yet the evidence lay in front of them. Records erased. Birth certificates sealed. Death records missing. Every anomaly hinted at someone manipulating genealogical traces, tidying the past to hide a pattern. But one chilling detail stood out above all. Every major gap in the records coincided with a cluster of unexplained disappearances across different eras: 1891, 1624, 1470. And in each case, a descendant of the ancient bloodline vanished without a trace. Not murdered. Not buried. Removed. As though they had been taken to complete or continue the ritual. Whitmore struggled to maintain composure. He couldn't accept that a medieval cult had survived for hundreds of years. People didn't keep traditions like that alive, not in secret, not without someone exposing them. But Lena insisted they were thinking about it the wrong way. It isn't an organization, she said. Not anymore. Not a group of robed monks chanting in the woods. It's a belief passed down through individuals. A doctrine preserved in fragments. Only one successor at a time is needed to continue a ritual. One student of the old texts. One believer convinced that they are upholding a sacred duty. It's not a cult now. It's a lineage of its own. That idea chilled him more than the idea of a cult. A group could be dismantled. A single zealot, acting alone, could disappear for decades and re-emerge with perfect knowledge of the ritual. But there was more. As the genealogists connected the final bloodline threads, they discovered that Marissa's pendant, the missing item from the crime scene, was more than jewelry. It was a copy of an ancient sigil worn by descendants of a medieval protector family. The pendant's origins were impossible to fully trace, but Lena found mention of similar amulets in 14th-century manuscripts describing the chosen vessel's emblem. If the killer had taken the pendant, it wasn't a trophy. It was a requirement. Whitmore couldn't sleep that night. His mind replayed every detail: the symbol carved into Marissa's skin, the missing pendant, the faded scratches on the shed doorframe, Elias Corvin's desperate warnings. All of it pointed to a terrifying thought, that someone believed the ritual was active again. Someone who knew which bloodlines mattered. By morning, exhaustion clung to him, but adrenaline kept him upright. When he entered the precinct, he found Lena already there, surrounded by stacks of photocopied medieval texts. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fatigue but from the weight of the discovery she was preparing to share. She pointed to a line in a translated manuscript, "When the bloodline splits thrice and reunites once more, the vessel shall appear. The watcher shall know them by the sign they bear." Whitmore frowned. "What sign?" Lena lifted a photo of Marissa's pendant. "This." He stared at it in stunned silence. Then she showed him the genealogical chart again, this time with new links added. As the missing branches were filled, the convergence became clearer, unmistakable. Marissa wasn't the only descendant alive in the area. 2 more lived within a 50-mile radius. And one lived less than 5 miles from the murder site. That alone was enough to raise alarms. But then Lena circled another name, one that made Whitmore's stomach twist. A name belonging to someone involved in the investigation. A team member. Not a suspect. A victim. A target. According to the bloodline pattern, they were next. Whitmore's pulse quickened. If the killer had traced this bloodline as meticulously as Lena had, then they already knew who the next chosen descendant was. And worse, they were likely watching them already. As Whitmore absorbed the enormity of the revelation, Lena added something even more horrifying: "I checked the archives again. The same bloodline that leads to our next potential victim, it also ties back to Elias Corvin's family." Whitmore froze. "So Elias wasn't chosen at random," she said. "He wasn't delusional. He was one of them. A descendant. And someone hunted him." "Which means," Whitmore whispered, realization dawning like a cold sunrise, "they didn't fail to complete the ritual in 1891. He swallowed hard. They were interrupted. And now, over a century later, they were trying again, picking up exactly where they left off." Daniel's discovery of the trunk wasn't coincidence. Marissa's murder wasn't the beginning. It was a continuation. The ritual had simply been waiting for the right blood to surface. The cycle hadn't restarted. It had been dormant. And now, it was awake again. The silence in the precinct that morning felt unnatural, thick, like the air before a storm. Everyone sensed the investigation had crossed into territory no training manual had ever prepared them for. But while Whitmore wrestled with the genealogical implications, Lena felt there was still something missing. A piece of Elias Corvin's story that the letters alone couldn't reveal. Something he hadn't written, or something he had written, but had been removed. It started with a detail Daniel mentioned casually when he first showed her the trunk. He said the interior lining looked distorted, as if something heavier than paper had pressed against it for years. At the time, Lena assumed it was simply the notebook or bundles of letters. But now, as she pored over Elias's writings and cross-referenced them with records from his town, an odd pattern emerged. Several events Elias referenced never appeared in any official documentation. Public disturbances, disappearances, whispers of council meetings that left no trace in town archives. There were inconsistencies, holes in the narrative, as if Elias's notes were the only testimony of a much larger, hidden struggle. But one letter troubled her above all. The final one before Elias wrote his terrified warning. The handwriting shifted sharply from his usual controlled elegance into rushed, uneven strokes, as though he'd written under duress. The letter referenced something called the Ledger of Names, an object he claimed held the identities of those tied to the ancient bloodline. But he never described it in detail. He never mentioned its location. He never said who possessed it. Then the letters ended abruptly, too abruptly for Lena's comfort. She returned to the trunk herself. Daniel let her take it for examination, though he admitted he hadn't slept properly since finding it. The trunk sat on a metal evidence table, illuminated by a single overhead lamp. Lena ran her fingers along the interior, feeling the grooves, the indentations. Something about the way the bottom panel sat against the wood seemed off-balanced. She pushed gently, then harder. It shifted. There was a false bottom. Beneath it, she found what Elias had hidden. Not a ledger, but fragments, torn from a journal. Pages ripped unevenly, edges frayed, ink smudged. Some sentences remained legible, others were faded beyond recovery. But what survived was enough to shift the course of the entire investigation. The first fragment read, "They have infiltrated us. One sits within our circle pretending to help but guiding us toward ruin. The traitor wears trust like a mask." Another fragment mentioned a secret meeting Elias attended after hearing rumors that the ritualists were still active. He described overhearing voices in the chapel cellar, men arguing about a failed attempt to secure the vessel and blaming someone among them for the failure. The identity of this betrayer wasn't written. Instead, Elias had drawn a rough sketch of a man's silhouette with no face, accompanied by a single line, "He stands where truth should stand." The implication was unmistakable: someone assisting Elias, or someone close to him, was secretly protecting the cult's surviving members. But the most disturbing fragment was a half-burned page that seemed to describe Elias's final days. "I cannot trust them. I cannot trust anyone. Even those who claim to hunt the keepers are guided by lies. I hear the traitors speaking with them at night. I know now that one of them is chosen. They will not stop until the cycle is complete." Lena's breath caught. One of them was chosen. Did Elias mean one of his acquaintances? His neighbors? His investigative circle? Or someone larger, someone meant to continue the ritual, who had survived into the modern era? Lena felt cold sweep across her arms. The timeline became even more tangled. If the ritual wasn't intended to end in the 1890s, and Elias believed the traitor was working to protect the cult, then what happened to Elias? Daniel's next call provided the missing piece. He told her about an auction catalog his aunt had shown him, a local estate sale happening that very weekend. Among the listed items was something that made his voice tremble, a journal belonging to E.C. Written in the late 1800s, partially fire-damaged. They rushed to the auction house. When Lena saw the journal, locked in a glass case, pages curled from heat damage, she knew immediately it was Elias's. Her hands shook as she donned gloves and turned the fragile pages. Many were unreadable, ink melted into brown stains. Others survived just enough to offer glimpses of Elias's final discoveries. He wrote of a hidden chamber beneath the chapel, of symbols carved into stone older than the structure itself, of a ritual site prepared long before the town existed. He wrote of voices chanting in a language he didn't know, of candles arranged in patterns identical to medieval ritual diagrams. And worst of all, he described a realization he came to far too late: the traitor is not protecting them. He is guiding them. He wants the ritual to succeed this time. He believes he was chosen to finish what his ancestors began. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. A traitor in the investigation. Someone hiding in plain sight. Not just in Elias's time. But now. Because if the ritual survived through centuries, passed from believer to believer, then it was likely that each generation had its protector, someone tasked not with performing the ritual, but ensuring conditions remained perfect for it to be completed at the right moment. Someone who might have already infiltrated the modern investigation. Lena turned to Whitmore, who had accompanied her, and said quietly, "One of our own could be continuing the work that began in medieval times." He didn't respond. Not immediately. His jaw twitched as he studied Elias's burned words, his silence filled with dread. He glanced around the auction hall, suddenly paranoid that any face in the crowd might belong to someone who knew more than they pretended, someone who had waited a lifetime for the right descendant to appear. Later, back at the precinct, Whitmore called an emergency meeting. But even as he entered the room, he felt the weight of eyes watching him, eyes that might belong to the traitor Elias described. Someone who now had access to the team's movements, their theories, their fears. The investigation had splintered earlier. Now, it was infected. The missing pages had not just answered questions. They had opened new, more dangerous ones. If the traitor existed in Elias's time. If the lineage of belief had survived. If one successor had been trained for this moment. Then the ritual wasn't merely returning. It was being orchestrated. And the orchestrator might be closer than any of them realized. The call came just after dawn, shattering whatever fragile sense of order the investigative team had managed to preserve. A jogger found the body near the old Willow Creek footbridge, an area usually quiet, tucked between a wooded walking trail and the riverbank. When Whitmore arrived, the morning mist clung to the ground like a living thing, coiling around tree roots and drifting over the corpse lying on the damp earth. Another victim. Another descendant. And this time, the ritual markings were even clearer. The woman appeared to be in her late 20s. Her clothing neatly arranged. Her hands placed over her stomach. Her eyes closed, not forced shut, not swollen or bruised, but gently closed, as if someone had granted her a final peaceful moment despite the horror surrounding her death. But the serenity ended there. On her bare abdomen was a precise diagram carved into the skin, a symbol far more elaborate than the one left on Marissa Hale. Lena crouched beside the body, breath shallow. She didn't speak at first, she simply stared, piecing together everything she had learned about the medieval rituals. The new carving wasn't just a symbol, it was a complete ritual map. 10 circles interconnected, divided by symmetrical lines. The 10th veil fully represented. "This is medieval," she whispered. "This is exactly how the ritual was diagrammed in the manuscripts." Whitmore felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. The diagram wasn't decorative or random. It had intention. It indicated progression. If Marissa's symbol had been the beginning, this was the second stage. The killer, or the orchestrator, was escalating. The medical examiner arrived shortly after, visibly shaken. She examined the body without speaking until finally she muttered, "This was done by someone who knew anatomy. They avoided major vessels. They avoided causing too much external blood loss. It's deliberate." Whitmore understood what she meant. The purpose of the ritual wasn't to kill violently. It was to prepare. But prepare for what? As the team began their sweep of the area, they discovered something chilling along the trees, small candles melted into the roots, arranged in a pattern. Wax trails dripped down the bark like pale veins. Someone had prepared the scene hours earlier. Maybe the killer worked alone. Maybe not. A trail of footprints led deeper into the woods, but fresh rainfall had washed most of them into muddy suggestions of movement, no direction, no identity. Whoever had been here knew how to vanish. While the team catalogued evidence, Lena walked the perimeter, pausing at the footbridge. She stared at the river below, listening to the soft rush of water. A memory surfaced, faint but unmistakable. She had seen that symbol before. Not in a book. Not in the precinct. In her childhood home. For a moment, the world around her blurred. She remembered an old family Bible her grandmother kept locked in a chest. Inside, tucked between yellowed pages, was a small circular sketch made in faded ink, an early version of the same ritual symbol. As a child, she never understood it. But the memory returned with stunning clarity now. What if her family had been connected? What if the symbol wasn't merely academic curiosity? What if her grandmother hadn't told her everything? Whitmore noticed something was wrong and approached her slowly. "You okay?" "Fine," she lied, forcing the memory back into the dark. "Just thinking." She wasn't ready to admit what she had remembered, not until she confirmed it. Not until she understood what it meant. That memory connected her to Elias Corvin's world in ways she wasn't prepared to face. Meanwhile, the investigation began to fracture publicly. News outlets swarmed the footbridge, reporting cult-like symbolism and a possible serial ritualist on the loose. Citizens panicked. Churches filled with frightened whispers. Parents kept their children indoors. Social media spiraled into chaos, threads linking the murders to everything from demonic possession to secret societies controlling the government. The truth was far worse than any of those theories. The truth had survived since medieval times, passed like a torch to those who believed themselves chosen. As daylight settled over the crime scene, Whitmore and Lena stood over the body, silent but burdened by the same realization: this wasn't random brutality. This was tradition. A revival. A ritual uninterrupted. When they returned to the precinct, the team was restless, talking over each other, arguing about leads that went nowhere. Some detectives blamed the press, others blamed the department for letting hysteria grow, but everyone felt the pressure tightening like a noose around the entire investigation. And then, hours later, a new detail surfaced, one that plunged the team into deeper dread. Daniel Mercer walked into the precinct carrying an envelope left on his doorstep earlier that morning. No postage. No signature. Inside was a single sheet of parchment aged in the same way as the papers in Elias's trunk. The handwriting was unmistakable. Two have fallen. The bloodline thins. The vessel draws near. Below the words, the full ritual symbol, the same one carved into the second victim. When Lena compared the handwriting to Elias's letters, her heart pounded. It wasn't a mere imitation. It was the same flowing style, the same archaic curls, the same ink pressure patterns. Someone wasn't just copying Elias. Someone had access to writing materials or templates that matched the 19th century. Someone who had inherited the beliefs of the Custodes Noctis, maybe even their artifacts. Or someone who wanted Daniel, specifically, to believe they did. Whitmore rubbed his forehead, leaning over the evidence table. They're taunting us. They want us to see the pattern. Yes, Lena whispered, but they also want Daniel involved. These letters aren't threats. They're invitations. Daniel felt the weight of the room shift toward him as all eyes turned his way. He didn't know what terrified him more, the idea that someone was watching him. Or the idea that someone thought he mattered to the ritual. As the night wore on, the team gathered around genealogical charts, ritual diagrams, old letters, modern crime scene photos. Everything pointed toward an accelerating cycle, one that was drawing closer to its final stage. The candles. The symbols. The positioning of the bodies. The escalating complexity of the markings. This wasn't a spree. It wasn't improvisation. It was a sequence. A countdown. And as exhaustion seeped into the precinct, Lena studied the second victim's markings again, seeing something she hadn't seen before. A small symbol inside one of the circles, an almost invisible marking, like a personal signature of the ritualist. Her voice shook as she pointed it out. Look at this. This wasn't in the medieval diagrams. It wasn't in the manuscripts. This is new. Whitmore stared at the tiny glyph. A mark of identity. A signature. Proof that the orchestrator wasn't just reenacting history. They were modifying it. Personalizing it. Meaning the killer wasn't merely a follower of tradition. They believed they were its successor. Its heir. Its completion. And somewhere in the depths of the ritual, somewhere in the darkness of a lineage traced across centuries, the true purpose of the killings waited. Watching. Waiting for the final stage to begin. The discovery of the second victim left the entire investigative team shaken, but nothing prepared them for what came next. Late that night, while the precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed dully and officers sifted through reports with aching eyes, Daniel Mercer sat alone in an interrogation room, staring at the letters he had brought from home. Not the ones he had found earlier, but a new one. A letter he hadn't dared to open until now. It had arrived hours before he came to the station, slipped beneath his front door with no sound, no warning. The envelope looked older than the building he lived in, parchment yellowed and brittle, sealed with a hardened lump of cracked red wax. His name wasn't written on it. Instead, a symbol was drawn across the surface in deep black ink, the full 10th veil diagram, precisely the same as the one carved into the second victim's skin. His hand trembled as he finally broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page. Heavy paper. Smooth. Too smooth for anything modern. The handwriting was unmistakably the same archaic style as Elias Corvin's. And yet, this letter was dated 3 days ago. Daniel felt the room tilt. He read the opening line aloud under his breath, "To the one who opens the path, you were meant to find the trunk." His heartbeat quickened. The words weren't a threat. They weren't even directed at a victim. They were directed at him. The letter continued, "The cycle stirs only when the rightful hands disturb the remnants of the past. Your bloodline bears the memory. Your discovery has awakened what was promised." Daniel froze. He wasn't part of any bloodline connected to these rituals, or at least, he believed he wasn't. His ancestry had always been a vague mix of family lore and half-remembered stories. But now, with everything he had learned, he couldn't dismiss the possibility. What if the trunk didn't just end up in his attic? What if it had been placed there generations ago? Waiting for him. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still, pacing the room as the letter continued to haunt him from the table. The next lines were worse. "Elias failed to deliver the vessel. But you will not fail. The ritual moves toward its end because you have begun it." Daniel's breath caught. He grabbed the page again, eyes scanning for meaning, for reason, for anything that would ground him. All he found was dread. Whitmore and Lena entered the room a few minutes later, summoned by Daniel's frantic request. They listened in stunned silence as he read the letter aloud. Whitmore looked as though someone had punched the air out of him. Lena, however, reacted differently. Her face went pale, too pale, but her eyes stayed fixed on the letter like she was trying to see something hidden between the ink strokes. "Let me see it," she said quietly. She took the page, studying every curve of the writing. When she turned it over, her breath hitched. On the back of the page was a drawn diagram, an old map of the town, roads, and landmarks barely recognizable. But one marking stood out, a circle drawn beneath the modern city center, labeled in faded Latin. Lena whispered the translation, "Sanctum of the 10th Veil." A ritual chamber. A location buried beneath the town, beneath their feet, unused but not forgotten. And the letter claimed Elias had been heading there before he disappeared. Whitmore leaned over the map, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. This is under the old chapel district. They built over it years ago. The tunnels are still down there, but most were sealed off. "Not all of them," Lena said. "Look at the markings. This entrance still exists. The killer knows it." Daniel felt his stomach twist. "Why send this to me?" Whitmore looked up slowly, eyes heavy with a realization he didn't want to voice. "Because they think you're part of the ritual now," he said. "Or worse, they think you were meant to be." The room fell into suffocating silence. The killer wasn't simply taunting them anymore. They were leading them. Guiding them toward the ritual's final stage. And as Whitmore called for backup, Lena stared at the letter, her fear buried beneath something sharper, recognition. She had seen Elias's handwriting before. She had seen that symbol before. In her grandmother's Bible. In her childhood memories. The truth struck her like a blow. She wasn't just investigating the bloodline. She was part of it. And if the killer knew that, they were already ahead of them. Already waiting. The underground chamber was colder than the morning air above it, the stone walls sweating with age, the silence broken only by the drip of unseen water. Whitmore's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing symbols carved deep into the walls, identical to the ones on the victims. Candles still burned, their flames trembling as if disturbed moments before. Someone had been here. Recently. At the center of the chamber stood a raised stone platform, stained from centuries of rituals. Footprints circled it, fresh, overlapping. Lena felt her pulse hammer as she stepped closer. Something called to her from the darkness, something she didn't want to understand. Then Whitmore found him. A man standing behind a pillar, hands raised, surrendering without resistance. A follower, not the architect. He spoke calmly, almost reverently, "You're too late. The vessel has already been chosen." His eyes shifted toward Lena. A chill tore through her as she realized the truth. She wasn't just connected to the bloodline, she was the culmination of it. Hours later, back home, Lena found a single envelope on her doorstep. No return address. Just the symbol. Waiting.